sense to,
Probably gonna spend right.
yeah. So, who are you gonna have do any design work for you?
So far, we're still construction.
Because they're gonna need to figure out how big of a connection you think you'll need, and then we'll have to look for our records and find out if there is an existing building there and what connection size they have. Because the existing connection will offset your cost for current connection. So if you need a 2-inch connection and you had a 1-inch connection, you get a partial credit.
So for the software fee, it's like a separate process.
Sean is not gonna be here.
Yeah,
You sell enough books on the weekend?
yeah, so you don't pay the extra
Yeah,
additional
we got
cost.
rid of a lot of books. We didn't make,
And that's why I say
particularly
you
more money than
kind of
usual.
need to know.
I thought the $8 a bag was a good idea though, because, I mean, I got a bag, because I usually only get a couple, and then I get
Yeah.
bored of looking at them and
Yeah.
whatever.
So if you.
well,
Makes you buy a
And
little
then the
more.
other question
We
would
had-
be for.
you know, part of the goal
public
was
works,
get
and
rid of
that
books
is
this time.
if
If
your
you're talking
existing
about making
building
money, I
has
don't
a
know which
connection,
way is more
Well,
profitable
you
to.
tie into
Obviously,
that
I
connection,
have no idea how to make money either,
separate
otherwise I would
connection
have some.
with a food cart along next door.
Okay.
Because if you have, because if the existing.
Everybody ready?
If it has a 2-inch
Okay.
connection, then you might have to argue that
Out of it.
it's already adequate. Right? But are you guys leasing that building or did you buy those? Okay, so if you bought them, so theoretically, worst comes to worst, you could always combine the lots. And then you have one lot with one connection, but that may not help you in the long run, depending on what one.
Recording in progress.
Future, right?
All right,
Pros and cons.
here we go. I'm gonna call this Solstice Planning Commission meeting to order at 7 PM on June 20th, 2024. The role of the Planning Commission is to hold workshops to review and make recommendations to the City Council on all manner of policy and legislative activities. In some cases, we act as a quasi-judicial board for land use cases, which can then be appealed to either the council, the hearings examiner, or a court. Not gonna do that tonight. Amanda, would you call roll?
Tel Jensen,
I'm here.
Brian Matson,
Here.
Sharon Watt,
Here,
Robin Zorich,
here,
Shauna Gawthorne.
All right, moving right along. Gonna ask for public comment for items not on the agenda right now. Anybody have anything to chat about? Don't be shy. Okay. Moving along then. Number two, agenda approval.
I move to approve the agenda?
seconded.
Motion's been made and seconded to approve the agenda. Any discussion? Anyone opposed to the agenda as written? Motion carries. Great work. Moving right along to consent items and approving the minutes of our May 16th, 2024 meeting.
In a surprising turn of events, I move that we approve the minutes.
I second.
All right. Motion's been made and seconded to approve the minutes. Any discussion about that? No. Anyone opposed to the minutes as written? Motion carries. Man, we're good at this. We're so good at this. Next up, we have a public hearing. This is public hearing WLD dash, wait, no, sorry. Item 24-0086. Is that right? I got that.
I also have it as 2022, but it is 2024.
Okay. All right. WLD 2024-026, zoning text amendment for mobile food units. So first up, gotta ask Commission if we have any ex parte communication or conflicts of interest to declare.
No.
No.
I love food. Otherwise, no. Moving on to presentation.
I'm Maylene Garcia DeBoard, the Associate Planner for the City of Woodland, and I will be going over a zoning text amendment for mobile food units. First, I'm just going to give a brief overview of kind of the structure of my presentation, just because I want to provide some context in the beginning. So first, what we're talking about, mobile food units. The definition proposed for that use is a readily movable food establishment. This includes a vehicle, trailer, push cart, vending stand, or similar that is used to serve food and/or beverages to the public. This definition is almost identical to the Cowlitz County Health and Human Services definition of a mobile food unit. That's where that term comes from. And like the definition says, it applies to things like food trucks or other types of food vendors. So what I'm going to talk about for context is 3 different permit types. That's a site plan review, a conditional use permit, and a temporary use permit. And then I'm going to shift gears and go into existing zoning regulations that could currently apply to the use that we're talking about, mobile food units. And then I'll get into the regulations that are already in place from other agencies and jurisdictions. And then I'll get into staff's recommendation. So for some context, when a use is permitted in a zone, they need to apply for a site plan review permit. That permit is $2,750. It's intended to be for kind of permanent, established businesses. There's no expiration or timeline. Once you're approved, you're approved. So to review that, a project has to comply with all zoning regulations, including things like setbacks, parking standards, landscaping, lot coverage, and in a lot of scenarios, they also have to come back for a final civil review. Another permit type that we have is a conditional use permit. When a use is conditional in a zone, they have to apply for a site plan review and a conditional use permit. A conditional use permit is $1,000, and again, that's on top of the $2,750 for the site plan review. And in addition to complying with all the standards on a site plan review, they also have to comply with special conditional use criteria. And then sometimes the city has specific regulations for specific conditional uses. So things like churches or schools, those are conditional uses, and they all have their own approval criteria. And then on top of that, there's a section in the conditional use code that allows staff to kind of create more strict standards regarding things like the hours of operation. We could implement specific setbacks, size restrictions, landscaping, things like that. And then the third land use permit is a temporary use permit. So when uses are temporary uses in a zone, they can apply for a temporary use permit, and that permit is $100, and it's limited to 180 calendar days. After those 180 days are up, they can't apply again for another 60, but after that they can apply again, establish the use for another 180 days. There are some criteria to grant a temporary use, and these are the only criteria that are applicable, so they don't need to go and meet any other codes. And those criteria that are applicable are that they can't be detrimental to the public health, safety, or welfare. They have to be compatible with the zone that they're in. They have to be compatible in intensity and appearance with existing land uses. They have to comply with setbacks, and they have to provide adequate parking, and they can't have adverse impacts from things like noise, light, or glare. So an example of that is the berry stand that's at Napa. They're limited to 180 days, and then they have to go away for at least 60. So these are some definitions of uses in our current zone, or excuse me, they're not definitions, but they're uses that are allowed in some zones. So permitted in C1, which is Central Business District, and C2, which is Highway Commercial, is things like restaurants, cafes, other eating and drinking establishments. So to apply for that, you would just need a site plan review. A conditional use in both of those zones are vending stands and kiosks. So to get a vending stand or a kiosk, you need a site plan review and a conditional use permit. And then there's a temporary use that's allowed in the central business district, and that's mobile vending carts. And now I'm going to get into kind of what each of those things are and what they apply to. So first, restaurant. Our city code does not define the term restaurant, and so in that situation we turn to state definitions. The state has a definition in their health code that defines restaurant as every place where prepared foods and beverages are sold and served to individuals, generally for consumption on the premises where sold. And again, a restaurant is permitted in C1 and in C2. And with a definition like that, you could make the case that a food truck or a mobile food unit falls under that use. But the issues with that are that the only option for a developer is to do a full-blown site plan review, the $2750 permit that's really meant for permanent uses. But also the regulations for a restaurant don't necessarily make sense for something like a mobile food unit, which doesn't really make it an ideal definition to fall under. So, for example, when you think of a typical restaurant, it's a building that needs a building permit. Something like a food truck or a food stand doesn't need a building permit. So then when you go and look at the parking standards for a mobile food unit classified as a restaurant, there's not a clear answer because parking standards are based on gross floor area of buildings, and something like a food truck is in a building, so there's no gross floor area. And then when you think of a restaurant, it's assumed that the customers are going to be inside of the building, so there are just a lot of other factors at play with things like food trucks that you have to consider. And so with all of that, it doesn't give developers or staff a clear path forward on how to permit their proposal, and that creates a lot of wasted energy and time trying to figure out an avenue for it to be approved. And it also doesn't create a lot of consistency because people could be told different things. And then we have kiosks. The code does define the term kiosk. It's a small structure with one or more open sides that is used to vend merchandise, such as newspapers, or services such as film developing. That's a pretty vague definition that could apply to mobile food units. So you could make the case that it's a conditional use in C1 and C2. But the issues with that is that it's an even bigger barrier than the last option. You need a site plan review and a conditional use permit. And then because a kiosk is a conditional use, it has its own set of criteria that you have to meet. And one of those is that you're limited to 100 square feet. And sometimes food trucks don't meet that standard. So because conditional uses create a lot of flexibility, and it allows staff to kind of add case-by-case restrictions. On the flip side of that, it means that we're reviewing things on a case-by-case basis, and when applicants are asking questions, we don't have a clear set of guidelines, and so we're not consistent. So we'd have to review everything on a case-by-case basis under a conditional use permit, which isn't ideal. And then lastly, we have mobile vending carts. There's no definition of mobile vending cart, but again, you could make the case that a food vendor falls under a mobile vending cart. It's a temporary use only in the central business district. So per code, there is probably an avenue to approve something like a food truck on a temporary basis in the C1 zone. But past that, it's a case-by-case basis review scenario, just because we don't have any specific regulations that are actually applicable, because when you look at the zoning code, it's not necessarily applicable. So I'm going to switch gears and talk about regulations that are already in place and that are already applicable to any mobile food units in the city of Woodland. So Washington State Labor and Industries, they review things like food trucks and trailers, and they get a sticker. So the city of Woodland wouldn't need to regulate the actual structure itself, because that's already taken care of. Cowlitz County Health and Human Services, they also review food trucks, even when they're in city limits. If they're in Cowlitz County, which most of the city is. There's only that small piece that's mostly residential. They have an incredibly lengthy review process. They're super thorough. They're reviewing for health concerns, so that's things like, what is their menu? Can their food truck prepare the food that's on that menu? Do they need a commissary kitchen? Where are they dumping? Where is their water coming from? Where is their wastewater going? They have a lot of requirements. They have specific requirements about restrooms, even grease traps. So that's all, again, something that the city wouldn't need to regulate unless we wanted to add more to the list. But Cowlitz County Health is really doing that work for us. Another one is a fire regulation. So there's a state program that Clark Cowlitz Fire and Rescue operates under, and they give mobile food units a sticker as well, and it's after they do a fire inspection. So CCFR is already regulating for fire and safety concerns, so again, that's something that the city doesn't have to take on. The only applicable city regulation is something we already do. All businesses within city limits need a woodland business license. So with all of that in mind, the city is tasked with deciding what zones mobile food units should be allowed in and how easy or difficult they should be to permit, or in what capacity. Should it be temporary or permanent? And are there any applicable regulations that should be added to the code? So staff's recommendation focuses on the central business district and the highway commercial district. So we've broken it up into two different types of uses, and they're both defined. So a mobile food unit, I talked about at the beginning what that definition is. I think that it would be important to specify that a mobile food unit on an individual basis should be regulated different than if you had 2 or more mobile units on a site. So we propose defining mobile food unit court as more than one mobile food unit on one site. And then in C1, we recommend that a mobile food unit on an individual basis, so kind of a secondary use, an accessory, it's probably on a site that's already developed. It could be allowed on both a temporary basis with a temporary use permit, or as a permanent year-round permitted use through a site plan review. Same thing for C2. And then for a mobile food unit court, staff recommends that that's not really a temporary use, so just permitted, so site plan review. And then within that, we've kind of set up some regulations that would apply to both of those uses. So for an individual mobile food unit, it makes sense for the city to check and make sure that they're getting all of those approvals that they're supposed to have. So that's the Woodland Business License, that's the Washington L&I sticker, the Cowlitz Health and Human Services. Cowlitz County actually has a list on their website that's publicly accessible, and you can go on there at any time and see what food trucks are approved to operate in the county. So that's pretty easy for us to check. And then the CCFR approval as well. And then so queuing. This is to ensure the safety of pedestrians waiting in line. There should be dedicated areas for customers to queue, and staff recommends that that's 10 feet away from anywhere vehicles are traveling, so parking lots, right-of-ways, and that ensures both their safety and that our sidewalks aren't being clogged. Compatibility. We want to make sure that if there's a site with only 2 parking spots, that a food truck isn't parked and using both of those parking spots, or that it's not blocking any access. And then ADA access. ADA access is from the parking lot to the mobile food unit itself. That's something that's already applicable to buildings. So it makes sense to also apply to a vehicle in this context. And then parking. The parking recommendation is within the actual parking section itself. It's 17.56. So staff recommends that well, I guess for some context, our parking code, at the beginning, it says that this is meant to be a guideline and it can be pretty flexible. So if someone comes in and wants to do something different, we can look at that and decide to go differently than the guideline that's in the parking standard. And I also think it's important to note that parking standards in 17.56 don't apply to temporary uses. They only apply to permitted site plan reviews. But we recommend that it be 2 parking spots for an individual mobile food unit and then 1.5 per mobile food unit, capped at 5 parking spots. Because really, if you think about a lot that has multiple food vendors, they're probably not all going to be busy at the same time or open at the same time. And if it's in a developer's best interest to propose more parking, they definitely can. And like I said, we can be pretty flexible with that requirement. And in the central business district, there's also a note in there that says that if they're under 30 vehicle trips, that they don't need additional parking at all, just because there's already so much public parking in C1. So really this parking standard would only apply to the highway commercial zone. And thinking about all the developed lots there, there's probably already adequate parking at any site that a food truck would want to park at. And then the compatibility piece, I think that really that's already covered by the temporary use code, and arguably so are the regulations for queuing, ADA access, and getting all of those approvals because, like I went over before, health and safety concerns are all things that need to be addressed in a temporary use permit. So I don't think that this is a big change from what's already required. It just gives staff a very clear set of regulations to consistently apply every single time, rather than wait for something to come in and ask the question, well, what is a health and safety concern and how should we address that? And that will create a lot more efficiency in our review. And then for a food court, that would be all the same regulations as an individual, with the exception of these 3. So restrooms. Staff recommends that there are restroom facilities within 500 feet of a mobile food unit and then available to both customers and to employees. And staff recommends that porta potties would not satisfy this requirement, and that's for 2 reasons. The first is to be consistent with the regulations already in place by the Cowlitz County Health and Human Services Department. And the second is to maintain a certain standard for really fine seating. Staff recommends that at least 2 tables are provided for customers. I think this is something that's in the developer's best interest anyway, and they'll probably put in more than this. But we do want to make sure that on a site where there are multiple food units, that there's somewhere dedicated for those pedestrians to sit and eat safely away from any vehicle traffic. And then staff did not make a recommendation about industrial zones, but I think it's worth having a discussion about. I thought about it personally, and I think that the benefits would be that you have more food trucks in more zones. You have the opportunity to let industrial businesses bring in a food truck just for an afternoon and provide their employees lunches, but I think that there are some issues on the flip side of that, and that includes that in the heavy industrial, there is not a precedent of any temporary uses allowed. There's not a temporary use section in the heavy industrial zone. All uses are allowed in the heavy industrial zone unless they're otherwise prohibited or conditional. So as of now, food truck is allowed in a heavy industrial zone. They would just need a site plan review. So that's not really something that we're proposing. It's just how it is. But another issue is that it could increase traffic in those areas if there's a well-established food court pod or mobile food unit and people are specifically driving to these industrial areas when they probably weren't before. And then I also think that pedestrian safety is a concern on industrial sites, so that'd be something we'd want to address if we were going to allow food vendors to be on industrial sites. And then while just kind of going through the code, I was reading a lot about temporary uses and site plan reviews, and so I just have a couple code cleanup things. The first one is that I think the intent of the code is that a temporary use is meant to be the only permit you get. It's supposed to be easier to do a temporary use. So when you apply for that $100 permit, it means you don't need a site plan review. You shouldn't have to pay another $3,000 on top of your $100. But if you go to Title 19 and you look at the list of exempt uses from a site plan review, temporary uses isn't there. I think that was just an oversight and it should probably be corrected. And then there's also a confusing section in the temporary use section itself. So if you open up the temporary use code, there's this whole section in there that says these uses are exempt from the temporary use standards. So they don't need a temporary use permit. They don't need to comply with the temporary use criteria of approval. And it lists like 5 or 6 items, things like Christmas tree sales in parking lots if it's less than 30 days, fireworks stands if they're less than, I think, a couple weeks. But then if you go to the zoning code, those uses don't exist, so they're not permitted in the first place. So I think that really they should be added to the list of allowed temporary uses in the C1 and the C2 zones. And then when you go to the temporary use code, it says, oh, these are allowed temporary uses, but you don't need to get a permit as long as you're under the 30 days that it specifies. Because right now, the code is set up to say that those uses aren't allowed at all. So it doesn't make much sense to call them out as specifically being exempt from temporary uses. And that is everything that I have. Do you have any questions?
Thanks, Melina. Any questions? Yes.
Yeah. So when you define your food trucks, I noticed that there wasn't in the not necessarily the definition, but what food trucks should be regulated.
Mm-hmm.
Did you put any thought into trucks that go home every night?
No,
Whether they should be
and
regulated or not? Because I know how I feel about that.
sure, yeah. I did think about that. That was kind of how this was first brought to my attention. And I think that the way that the code is set up is that land use regulates all uses, temporary or not. And Cowlitz County Health, they require that food trucks go back to their commissary kitchen every night. So if a food truck's commissary kitchen where they prepare their food isn't on the site that they're parked during the day, they have to leave every night anyway. If the place that they dump their wastewater is not on site, they have to leave every night anyway. And I think that virtually there's not a big difference between a food truck that is parked somewhere and never leaves and one that goes home every night, because when you visit during the day when the use is operating, it's still the same. You still have people driving to that site, parking, getting out of their car, making a transaction. It's a commercial use. The only difference is that if you were to visit the lot at night, in one scenario you wouldn't see a food truck, and in another scenario you would see a fully shut down, not operating, truly just a parked vehicle. And I think that the code isn't really set up to not regulate temporary uses, just because that'd create a big loophole. So what else are we, would we not regulate if it was temporary? I mean, in that scenario, I think then it'd be easy to say that anybody could go to any site and sell anything, and as long as they leave at night, then they're fine, but it's not really how we operate currently. I guess for an example, there's a vending stand that keeps showing up, and they're selling like flags and banners and political signs, and they're in the right of way. and they don't have any approved right-of-way permit, they don't have any approved temporary use permit, so it's a code enforcement issue. And I think with that, yeah, we probably wouldn't let a food truck just park on city property or in a right-of-way and operate without approval, so I think that giving them the option to do a temporary use instead is kind of the fix, because it's $100, it only takes a couple days to review, and the criteria is super easy to meet, and it's all things that are required whether we're gonna add these regulations or not. So I think it's more a question of, do we want to put those regulations in code so that every staff in the future can come back and reference them, or do we want to, ask that question every single time a food truck proposal is pitched to us, which is happening pretty often recently.
I feel that food trucks are an entry-level business. I'm not minimizing the costs that must go into these trucks.
Yeah.
By no means, right? But how do you know what a good site is? Maybe you want to drive around. Maybe you want to go to lunch at this job site because there's a bunch of people working there right now. And then 2 weeks from now, we're going to go over to this company because there's a bunch of people that take their lunch at swing shift or something.
Yeah.
You know what I mean? And I think that if you tie them to one spot, then that makes that difficult.
Yeah.
Like they have to put all their chips in before you figure stuff
Right.
truly out. But
Yeah, I think that the question I hear in that is, would the temporary use permit be tied to the truck, or would it be tied to the land? I think that it probably makes more sense to tie it to the land, which brings back the problem that you're raising about it being an entry-level permit, but I guess it'd be really difficult to regulate if it was tied to the food truck, because then we'd have to check in and see, where are you, what is that site like, because it probably is set up different than the other site. So really we'd have to review it for every site and then keep track of it a lot more.
maybe if they have to do their woodland business license, it could be a minimal review because it's not permanent. Maybe something, but that's not what you're proposing here. I'm just thinking out loud.
Yeah, well, that's what you're here for, so don't apologize for that.
One of the things that had come up in the past before we started dealing with these regulations, and that is, are they staying overnight, and what are they doing with their wastewater, and how are they getting their water? And the way Maylene has it structured is, theoretically, if there's going to be more than one and they want to potentially stay there on a permanent basis, that they should have some connection to the water and sewer system, as opposed to the one that's only there for a day or two a week. They
Right.
might have a garden hose, is that good enough? But if you have a food court, or a court, do you want a bunch of water hoses running all over the site for people to be using and then filling their tanks when they may or may not get emptied on a regular basis? So that's how we were thinking it before, because we have a couple units that are at 100 Davidson and this Auto, and they are only there during the day, and they are there as a temporary use permit, and under their health department, they got an agreement from Nameless Auto for their employees to use those restrooms, but there's no connection to sewer, there's no connection to water, and there's no restroom facility for the customers.
And I do just want to clarify that they are required by Cowlitz Health to empty regularly, and permanent connections to water and sewer are not allowed. So the only option, if they wanted to have a permanent connection, would be something like an RV hose or something like that.
Right. If somebody else has questions, you can ask them. I have another one though. Why did you settle on more than one is a pod and subject to pod standards? Was there any thought that, two isn't very many to me, right? Like the one at Davidson, I walk by there all the time. That doesn't seem like a food court pod to me. I mean, it's more than one, it's two, but it seems like the standards for the pods are more expensive to meet, right? And so I wonder how great of an effect two really is.
Yeah.
And I guess you gotta draw the line somewhere.
Yeah, and I think that was the thinking, is that the line does have to be drawn, but I think that if a lot has two, that those requirements are intended to be on the developer of that lot. So this is hard to
Two
explain
is
my
like a
thought
baby
process here.
pod to me,
Sure,
right? You know, it's not
sure, a
really a
baby
pod.
pod. Yeah, I think that it's just that when you have more than one, it creates more draw from customers just because there are more options. And I think that when you have more than one, it's probably intentional, where it's not necessarily secondary to the use. So like 100 Davidson doesn't really have a use besides those food trucks. And I think the intent there really is to function like a pod. It's just there's not a lot of trucks there at the moment. But I think that the court is really the developer's idea to have more than one. The property wants to draw more food trucks in, and so it should be on them to kind of provide those amenities, is the way I see it. But
I would also argue that we want to facilitate this type of activity, but we don't want it to outcompete our existing restaurants. And we want to draw the line somewhere that we want to encourage people to invest in the community. And so if we get somebody who's doing a food cart at a location once in a while, that's a lot different than somebody who's going to have them out there for 180 days straight. And then, so they're out there all summer competing with neighboring restaurants and that kind of stuff with no investment in the community, no consideration of those type of things. So,
You never see them outside of restaurants, do you?
yeah.
Okay, that makes sense.
Okay, any more questions before we move on?
One more. This doesn't allow any kind of drive-through, right? No drive-through access in these standards.
let
'Cause
me remind myself
That seems like it would be
the
site plan
definition.
review-ish, right?
So the definition does say used to serve food and or beverages to the public. I guess it doesn't specify if those are pedestrians or not, but drive-throughs are something that are regulated by a different use. So I think that's kiosk.
So, like coffee stands, there's always
Yeah,
drive-throughs,
yeah.
but those won't necessarily be, they have other standards besides these, is what you're
Mm-hmm.
saying? Okay.
Yeah.
Yeah, I think the drive-throughs could get gnarly with traffic and insufficient queuing capabilities and people parked out in the road.
Yeah. But it could be worth adding to the definition that the customers that they serve are not in a vehicle.
Okay. Move on.
That's all I have.
Okay. We'll have more time later if you think of something else. So city's the applicant in this case, right? Okay. All right. So in that case, I'm going to open up public testimony. So anybody who wants to say something about this particular agenda item, come on up. All right, fantastic. Just tell us your name and, if
my
you
name's
go on
Aaron.
for 15 minutes, I might have to shut you down.
Okay, I'll only take a couple of minutes. My name is Aaron Brown, and the name of our company is Station LLC. And we are in development right now, and have been for some time, of a mobile food court targeting central downtown business district between 2nd and 3rd and Davidson, which is the lot adjacent to the city parking lot where the voting happens, and the feed store, that property. In short, we're in favor of the proposed direction. We agree with the planning commission that there's nuances that should still be considered, like some of your questions were really good, Brian. Drive through other considerations of how we would like machine this to make it applicable would be very interesting to us, but at high level, we think that it's really helpful to have language that promotes our business rather than to have some language but it being fairly incomplete. It's hard to get liftoff when there's so much ambiguity. So the reason we're behind this at high level for starters anyways, is that this gives more definition to future business for the city of Woodland, ours included. And so that's what our 2 cents would be at this point. We're publicly willing to say that we're in favor of staff's recommendations at this point because it gives clarity to a pretty ambiguous set of code. Thank you for listening.
Yeah, thanks.
Thank you.
Appreciate it. Okay, anyone else? All right, if you change your mind, just throw up a signal. I guess it's time for commission deliberation. So I'm gonna close public testimony.
Not have invested as much as they had to, right? I understand that. I don't know if I'm sold on the 2 carts as a pod, but I think that might be just a matter of taste. I do strangely think that 3 carts is a pod, but I don't, for some reason 2 just doesn't seem to fit with my version of a pod, but, also I'm in favor of allowing it in industrial zones too. Industrial zones often have, frontage improvements already in because they've already been developed, so there's sidewalks and stuff. I'm not as worried about the pedestrians. They're gonna drive to get there or they work there.
Okay, great. Robin?
I agree. You don't want to have a business that is competing with, you know, a mobile cart. So I think it needs to be fair to everybody, and, I agree. Yeah.
Oh, you're kidding me.
All right, great. Thank you. Sharon?
Yeah, I have no particular objections to what's been presented. It seems reasonable to me, and, okay, I'm fine with it.
Can I say one more thing?
Of course.
Richfield has, I think it's 4 or 5, in an area fairly close to restaurants and stuff, and they do a really good job. As far as I can tell, the businesses downtown in Richfield are also very busy. So I think in that circumstance, I think it works really well together.
All right, great. Yeah, this is all making sense to me. I got a couple notes. Some of it's really trivial. It says you should have 4 tables. Do we want to, it says shall have 4 tables. Maybe we could say 4 or more.
So was it 2?
For, well, it's 2 until you've got, what was it? Anyway, this is not really substantive stuff, just small quibble. Seating. So 4 or more mobile food units shall have 4 tables with seating for customers. So
Okay.
I don't think anyone's gonna go out there and say you have too many tables, but
As long as they fit the space, I think.
yeah, I gotta justify me being here, so I gotta find things like this. But just kinda big picture, yeah, I think removing barriers to these kinda like, you know, minimum viable product thing is really a good idea. And yeah, obviously do have to balance that with folks who have made a more permanent investment in the community. But I think you've done, as it's written, I think you've done a pretty good job of that. Yeah, go on,
Can I say something
please.
else?
Yeah.
The one in Richfield has alcohol, or have we considered alcohol? I don't know, beer, wine?
That's a good question.
That is a good
That's
question.
a good
Robin.
question. I didn't think
Yeah.
of that.
I'd consider that a beverage. So falling under, if you were serving alcohol from a truck, a trailer, a table, as long as it got proper health approval and licensing. I guess that's another item to add to the list of approvals if applicable.
Okay.
I hate that I think this way, right? But I was young once. If you were serving alcohol, you would think there'd have to be a cap on hours of operation. don't want that at 2 in the morning, right?
Sure, yeah, and
Good.
and I think that it also ties in with the seating so that you're not getting a beverage and then walking down the street with it, you know, that you have somewhere
Right,
to
right. That's
consume that
another
on
good point.
site.
You're not gonna get a permit if you don't have that though, right? Like there, the
Probably
county's
not,
gonna
I don't
give you
know.
A liquor
There's
license.
state requirements for that probably that step in, right?
Yeah.
Okay.
Okay, that's good. Good catch, Robin.
Yeah.
What else was I thinking of? The parking requirements, I guess, you know, they're kind of already squishy as it is, but, you know, I don't know that this would actually apply anywhere, but if we could allow street parking to satisfy that requirement instead of off-street parking.
In the central business district, it does.
Okay. Okay,
I have a comment about that.
please.
If you are surrounded by other commercial properties, I don't see that as an issue whatsoever, right? But in my real job, every time I do a multifamily development, I get complaints that the parking on the streets of the surrounding single-family residences is constant, right? And if it's on parking on the residential side of the street because there's no parking over here, I just think you're gonna get calls about that.
I would love for Woodland to have a parking problem downtown.
I think that the central business district code that's saying you don't need extra parking is taking into consideration the public parking lots that we have and then also the street parking in the kind of downtown on Davidson. So there is street parking in the residential areas, but I think it's considering the fact that there's adequate parking within the commercial area.
I'll buy that.
So the requirement for the queuing to be away from a parking lot, 10 feet from a parking lot. I can imagine a situation where you're parked in the parking lot. And how does that seems like that would be difficult.
That's a good question. I think that, at least with the kind of more highway commercial business district areas, that they typically have a lot more parking than they need. So maybe it's worth specifying that if they provide some sort of physical barrier to make it clear that cars are not meant to drive in that area, even if it was originally built for maneuvering, as long as it wasn't taking up maneuvering space that's required for the use of the site. So if they're parked in the back, or somewhere that cars aren't going anywhere and that it's easy to kind of separate off.
Some sort of delineation of the queuing area
Yeah.
that isn't just striping, right?
And I think the best
Potted plants.
illustration of that is 100 Davidson, and those food cart pods are practically in the drive lane for the bank and the wellness clinic. So it's a great example of why we should have some kind of, whether it's, those vinyl fences or, cones with chains between the two, or
Right.
some physical demarcation that people will see and recognize.
If it is in a parking lot for an existing business, are we, and I think we should, but do we allow that to, bring that business below their required parking?
I think that's part of the idea between the temporary use, the single unit versus the court, simply because, let's use the AM/PM for example, you could probably put one there and not interfere with the flow of the development. But if you're putting in a court, you have to get a site plan review, which means you need to prove to the engineer and public works and the planner that you can do it safely and it's logically and it makes sense. We want to make it easy, but we don't want to make it unsafe and too easy.
Okay. Great. This is good. Let's see. I think it was kind of addressed as,
Standard about noise. And that's also a standard for site plan reviews. It's kind of a standard in all zones, really, I think, to get approved for anything that's a permitted use.
is that quantified?
I can't remember what that chapter is called. performance standards.
Right, for industrial areas and stuff,
Yeah. And typically, if you're going to have a court, they're going to be investing in the panels and the electrical upgrades that would allow them to plug those carts in, so they wouldn't be using generators. It would be part of the court's infrastructure, because you wouldn't want 5 or 6 or 7 of those all chugging away on generators.
Yeah. Even one though, like walking down the sidewalk, one noisy generator, obnoxious. So, you know, some people are gonna have to use generators sometimes. So I'm wondering if there is, maybe just make sure of that. I believe you. Maybe make sure that the noise thing covers it. And it's,
I guess the
something
only,
quantifiable.
yeah, the only other thing I can think of that would apply is I'm pretty sure that with a permitted use site plan review that something like that would have to be screened from view, but that might not necessarily cover the noise
Yeah, I want
all
like,
the way.
I feel
Yeah.
like I want a number, just like 38 decibels from 15 feet away or something like that.
Yeah,
I'd make
I
that
can
number.
check on that and see if there's a decibel in there, but I don't
know.
believe that there.
Okay.
Don't believe there is.
Typically, they're a certain amount of decibel increase over ambient for a certain amount of time.
Okay.
And it depends on how the regulation, I know our regulation is not written like that. It's a little more complicated. And you literally have to buy the city a new meter to be able to go out and measure that on a,
right.
on a
Yeah,
case,
I got one on
case
my
like
phone.
this. Yeah.
I mean, that probably wouldn't pass muster, but
I'm pretty sure there's
Okay.
an RCWs for nuisances that give you a number.
okay. What's a decibel meter cost? Anybody know? Alright. I'm gonna find out, and I might just buy one. Okay, what else was I thinking of? Just again, these are little things, not mostly substantial. But when we were talking about the administrative temporary uses, this is not. So one of them says parking lot sales that are not ancillary, and one of them says parking lot sales that are ancillary. Is that intentional, or is that?
I don't have it up in front of me, so
Okay.
I can't see quite
Okay.
what you're referring to.
So the central business district administrative temporary uses, the first one says parking lot sales that are not ancillary to the indoor sale of similar goods and services. Okay.
So that'd
not
be your
anci-
Christmas tree lots and stuff.
Well, it's got Christmas tree lots called out separately on there. But then for highway commercial district, it has parking lot sales which are ancillary to the indoor sale of similar goods and services, not to exceed 2 consecutive days.
I would assume that's intentional, but your guess is as good as mine.
Okay. Okay. Trying to understand that then. Why do they have to be not ancillary in the central business district and ancillary in the highway?
My guess is it probably has to do with the fact of the character of the downtown C1 district.
Okay.
As opposed to the highway commercial is primarily intended to pull cars into the site, whereas
Okay.
in the C1 district, there's not a lot of cars on site. Does that make sense?
Maybe
no,
to
not at
promote
all.
a viable, walkable
Right.
downtown.
They want to just, like, they've got some surplus that they need to unload, and they want to have a little parking lot sale. Is that of just their normal stuff? Is that ancillary or not ancillary?
Well, I guess that begs the question of, do they have a parking lot?
That's
They do,
ancillary.
it's in the back.
Yeah. Okay.
They do?
I've never seen
I've
it.
never seen it either, I just park on the street. But they're always pulling all their stuff out on the sidewalk in front of the place every day.
Yeah. This doesn't matter. I'm gonna move on. Okay. Kind of, this, as Brian was talking about, trucks that might come and go more regularly. What if somebody's just like passing through town and wants to, just like once? Or once every month, or,
Yeah, I think then it's just the implication of what other types of mobile units will we allow to operate on a one-time basis. We've got that massive discussion about the marijuana retail downtown. You know, if they moved into a truck, would we tell them they could park for a day and sell? Probably not. And it just feels like a can of worms to open.
It might not be fair to the other food trucks that are making more of a commitment to be in one spot every day too.
What if they get one free day a year? But it still has to be a food
If
truck.
you really wanted, you could say that food trucks are a temporary use, and then you could say that they're exempt from the temporary use requirements. You could even add food trucks to the list of exemptions from site plan reviews. Those are technically options. It's just not what staff recommended.
Okay.
But what about like fairs? Like we just have Planners Day.
Yeah.
What about those?
That's
the
a good question.
city-sponsored use and activity.
Yeah, so those are on city lots, and so they operate kind of outside of zoning regulations. They get approved under a special event permit. So if food trucks wanted to go, you know, at Horseshoe Lake, they could get a special event permit instead of any of this.
Okay. All right. I got also on Brian's moving around idea. Could we just make it like easy to amend somebody's permit? Is there any way to like kind of grease that?
Can you
Skeet a
explain
little
that a
bit?
little bit more?
Say so, you know, somebody gets a little permit to park downtown and that doesn't go well, so then they want to go out into the bottoms or industrial area.
I think that would be reasonable if it was a temporary use permit.
Okay.
And I think it's structured, Maylene structured it so that the $100 gets you the opportunity to try out a site. Whereas if you have somebody who's looking at a site that is prepped, how many units they have in there and how often they switch out, that's entirely up to them, because they're approved for up to 4 units, 6 units. We don't care. They could rotate every week. They could rotate spaces, just if somebody wants a better spot on the sidewalk.
Okay. Everybody all right? Okay, we'll keep going. Okay. Could we let somebody, when they do a temporary use permit, put more than one site on?
Put more than one mobile food unit on one site?
No. One, more than one location.
Oh, yeah,
Like-
that's a good question. I talked about this with Travis a little bit because I think that mobile food units are unique from other land uses because they are mobile. But when we're reviewing that mobile food unit, we're truly not reviewing the unit at all. L&I is doing that, the health department's doing that, CCFR is doing that. They have their business license. So if we're gonna regulate it for the land use, I think that's really about the land and the site that it's on. Is that site compatible for that food truck? Because really the truck itself, we know as a unit, it is good. It has so many stamps of approval. But if we did go the route of saying that a temporary use permit gets you 180 days, you can move to 180 sites in that time, then we'd want to look individually at every site, which there's not a ton to look at. The criteria is pretty simple. It's making sure they have all of those approvals, and if they do, that's not going to change site to site. It's just whether or not that site is big enough to accommodate it.
Could we say like $100 gets you your first site and then like $10 for each additional one?
I think that would require kind of changing the fee resolution or creating another type of permit. There's not really an avenue to do that
Okay.
currently, but that doesn't mean
Again-
it's impossible to create one.
Maybe if this comes up and people are complaining about it and asking for it, well, I think. Okay, last thing I had was, because these two cities are very similar, Woodland, and I recently visited Los Angeles. And I encountered these just like tiny, it's just like one guy and like basically the size of a small, does it at all.
So a bag of flour or something like that. And our code already has.
Recording in progress.
It already has the term like agricultural stand as a use. So I think there's also. I would say slushy or beverage.
Plus, I would argue that if it's on the sidewalk, it would need a right-of-way permit. And we also have the queuing standards, and the reason why we have those is so that they're not clogging sidewalks while they're ordering and waiting for their orders, that there's still a way to get through. So I
Again,
think,
this is like one kid with a. It's not. Gonna happen.
I think that
I'm
the.
dreaming, sorry.
Well, I think that
It's a
the
distraction.
county would also see slushies as something that they would regulate, and then they'd already have to follow,
Okay.
80% of the
I follow you.
regulations.
Okay, all right.
I'm
I think I've drawn this out long enough.
I'm picturing you trying to regulate a lemonade stand
Yeah.
by a couple of Cub Scouts, man.
Okay, any more thoughts? I think, yeah.
May we ask a question?
Sure. Yeah. Why don't you make sure we can hear it on the record though, so, sorry.
I'm Katie Brown. Thank you. I guess the question I have is, with the temporary use permit only being $100 and getting 180 calendar days, that there's going to be a lot of food trucks that are going to want to take advantage of that. And so you're going to have a lot of single food trucks everywhere with generators and hoses and all those things is what it kind of seems like to me. So how do you kind of streamline that in order to be more of the pod structure creates kind of more organization, that they've got the water, they've got the bathrooms, they've got the trash, that the people are coming to the area. I'm just thinking, that's just what was coming to me, is because a food truck's going to go $100. Well, I'm just going to go park all over, and it'll just kind of, they'll be all randomly placed instead of kind of a more streamlined, organized situation. That's my thought.
All right, thanks. Can we, yeah, I don't know. You have thoughts about that?
Can I respond to that question?
Please.
Just off the top of my head?
Yeah.
I've always found that pods generate more traffic than your single. Just the idea that there are more choices in one destination, I think people are drawn to that more than they are to a single, maybe a single unit that they're gonna go over to because they're getting gas right here. You know what I mean? I almost see it, the single one's a convenience visit rather than a destination visit.
And I also, I like the parking downtown. I would love for there to be just like people to think Woodland is a valuable enough destination that we're clogged with food carts, right? Because that would, like, for that scenario to come to pass, there's going to be a lot of people going to food carts, right? Otherwise, they're just not going to show. So, I appreciate what you're saying. If it comes to be a problem, yeah, we'll cross that bridge when we come to it. Okay, anything else? Before we feel like we have a pretty good handle on what we want? Okay.
All right, I'll start it off if you want.
By all means.
I move that we adopt staff's recommendation with the change that a pod is 3 units or more, and that it's allowed in the industrial zone. I don't know if you guys have a heartburn between drawing the line between the 2 or the 3, but that's just, since I'm starting, that's what I'm starting with.
Okay. All right. Anyone interested in seconding that? You're not voting yes. You're just seconding.
Okay, I'll second it.
Okay. Motion's been made and seconded. Any discussion on the motion? Perhaps the number of cards that constitutes a court.
A court?
Yeah, that's we've got a single and we've got a court right now.
Okay.
Brian is proposing a single, a double, and a court.
Okay, I agree.
You all right with that?
That it should be three.
3 works?
I don't, does that work for you?
If you have serious heartburn about this stuff, I want you to speak up if there's something I'm missing.
No heartburn.
Okay.
So.
Ultimately, I think it
Okay,
might be.
Okay, so then what's the two that are behind 100 Davidson, then they're not a pod, right? So what are they?
Correct. They're 2 separate food carts subject to the regulations that every food cart has to go through.
8-0 comprehensive plan periodic update. Sorry, 2025 comprehensive plan periodic update.
So I actually just wanted to make sure that you know that we are working on the comprehensive plan update. We have, for the grant for Department of Commerce, we are updating the website constantly, and you're going to see some new documents show up. So we've written the Parks and Recreation element based on last year's Park and Rec plan that was adopted. We also have the climate resilience element, which is based upon the adopted climate resilience plan that was adopted. And we have updated the capital facilities plan using the water and sewer plan for that basis to make sure that we've the infrastructure there. And also there's some miscellaneous information about the school district, the police, the fire, and that's available. Those elements which have been drafted will be available online. We also have a schedule of upcoming meetings and open houses where people will be able to come in and take a look at those documents and talk to staff, in addition to being able to review those online. So we're going to be working with the consultant to do a public presentation, probably, we're hoping, in July. So we're trying to set that up. Now, I do have one additional issue which I would like to cover, which is not on the agenda, but it's kind of in the staff report portion of the agenda. So if you don't have any questions about that.
I do. I got a couple comp plan questions. Sorry.
Okay.
They should be quick. So I was just looking at the memo from SCJ.
Yep.
Looking at the different legislative changes.
Mm-hmm.
Do all those apply to us?
Not all of them do apply to us.
Okay.
That's just a generic summary of each of the regulations, and for example, some of those are not subject to us because we're under 25,000 population and we're not in an urban growth boundary of a metropolitan statistical area. So not all of them do, and that's their first brush at the stuff that has changed since we updated our plan. And then attached to that memo is a checklist which has a bunch of technical analysis as to what our code needs or what our comp plan needs to discuss when we're done with this process by December of next year.
Okay. How about specifically the ADU bit?
So that's an interesting question. I do not believe that that one applies to us directly, but we had done the work to get that done in 2021, and then it went to the council, and the council did a first reading, but they didn't do a second reading, so that's still in kind of a holding pattern, but we have done that work. And if you remember, it included not only the streamlining of the ADU process, but simplifying the SEPA process, increasing the short plat process from 4 to 9 lots, duplexes on corner lots where there was one driveway on each lot. So if you remember going through that process.
I do, and I thought you did a great job.
Yeah, so that work has been done. We just haven't picked it up, and it'll be part of this discussion.
Okay.
And I think it's going to be important because in the end, we don't have enough land within the city boundaries and the urban growth boundary unless we increase densities. So the only other option would be to do expand our urban growth boundary, and Cowlitz is not amenable to that. So unless Cowlitz County is willing to increase our urban growth boundary, we're going to have to increase densities, or we won't be in compliance with the Growth Management Act.
Okay. And how about the tribal participation part? You know if that applies to us? There's it's House Bill 1717, new requirements regarding tribal participation in planning efforts.
So we do have a public participation plan that was approved by the council, and it should be up on the website. If it's not.
Tribal participation.
Oh, tribal participation. So we do have a tribal contact, and we haven't talked to them yet, but yeah, with that, they will be involved in that.
Okay, cool. Thanks. You can move on. Unless anyone else does. Okay, great. So we got this ICC.
Okay, thank you. So you recently reviewed the Retooling Our Code 2024 batch of code amendments, and one of those code amendments was the definition for yards, and it referred to the Uniform Building Code, and the Uniform Building Code no longer exists. We now use the International Building Code, and at the last council meeting, they declined to do the first reading of the Retooling Our Code batch because there was some question about using international codes as opposed to local codes. And so this has been brought up several times, and over the last 4 or 5 years, this has led to several delays in the adoption of codes and amendments. So I decided to bite the bullet and just do the research and do a presentation. So I wanted to do a dry run of that today before it goes to the council at the next meeting. So you're going to have to endure this while I do my practice run. So the International Code Council is the body that generates the international codes, whether that's International Fire Code, Building Code, Plumbing Code. They're all I codes now. What's important to know is that the International Code Council is the premier building safety solutions provider. It is a non-profit, non-stock corporation organized as a 501c6. So it's a nonprofit. It is based in America, and it has offices in Birmingham, Alabama, Chicago, Illinois, LA, California, and the headquarters in Washington, D.C. And the corporate bylaws are publicly available on their website. The ICC was formed in 1994, and their first set of codes became effective in 2004. And the goal of the ICC is to develop a single set of national model construction codes for throughout the U.S. And at the time, they combined 3 different organizations, and they were the Building Officials and Code Administrators International, or BOCA, the International Conference of Building Officials, ICBO, or the Southern Building Code Congress International, the SBCCI. So those were all private corporations in the United States that combined to a single standard. And the ICC was formed at the request of stakeholders in the building industries in order to develop a single set of national codes. And they're intended to coordinate consistent and comprehensive codes that include generally the 3 main categories: construction, fire, and energy code. This was extremely important because at the time, if you were in California and you ordered a air conditioner that was built in the South, it might not have the same standards. And so these would arrive on a truck, and then you'd find out, oh, the inspector won't accept them because they don't have a sticker for California or Washington, only for Florida, Georgia, something ridiculous like that. And they're all applying different standards, and of course the standards for air conditioning in the South are different from their New York and Washington. So generally there was so much confusion and issues in the industry on both the consumer and the producer side. They came together and created this movement amongst themselves. It was not government top-down mandate. How is the ICC run? There are 63 members, and they act as the board of directors for this corporation. There are 51 American representatives, 1 for each state and the District of Columbia. There are 10 Canadian representatives, 1 for each province, and 1 representative for Mexico and 1 representative for the Caribbean. That's why these are international codes. And they were international codes before because, of course, the southern organization included the Caribbean and Mexico. And then, of course, you had the Northeast one that included Ontario and Quebec and the Pacific Maritime provinces. And then on the West Coast, you had British Columbia and Alberta as part of the Pacific Northwest. So it always has been international codes because essentially America is the leader in the building code industry. It's always been that way. So they've always been international organizations. Who are the members of the ICC? There are 64,000 individual members of this organization. They include architects, engineers, contractors, manufacturers, government officials, and students. And of those members, there are members from 41 countries. So again, it is an international leader in the building industry and the building construction industry. What does the ICC do? Well, they do everything from training and education, personal certification, product evaluation certification so that it can go internationally and nationally, content management and digitalization, technical support and consulting services, and accreditation. So they have a wide mandate and a bunch of services that they provide in multiple industries. So let's talk about the building code you want, and they will consider it. Those code changes are posted publicly on their website and available for everyone in the public. And the next step after they do the advertisement is the committee action the committee action hearing, which is a public hearing. So I'll focus on that for a second. This is the flow chart for a consensus decision-making process. What you have is you have a proposal, and it is presented or made available for all of the members and the public to look at, and the members of the committee are tested. And if the answer is yes, if everybody agrees, the answer is yes, and it goes forward with a recommendation for inclusion into the code, whatever that is. If the answer is no, then anybody who objects can raise their concerns in this public forum, and they can either propose a modification to the proposal, which gets voted on after that, or it just goes back into general discussion, and everybody has the opportunity to talk about it, and then the modification or the proposal goes back to consensus, and if the answer is still no, you bring up the concerns again, and you go back into discussion, and you stay in this loop until one of two things happen, and that is somebody who raises concern blocks it and says, there is no way that I'm going to include this in the code, at which point it just doesn't go forward with the recommendation. Or they agree, okay, I've raised my issues, and I don't think this will be applicable in my state, but I'm not going to block it. I'm going to let it go forward to be considered by the membership of the organization. So everything, every code has to be agreed upon by consensus, or people have to be willing to, stand aside. And under no circumstances can they not block if they feel that it's not willing to be done. That's why they only update the code every 3 years, because a ton of stuff comes in, and sometimes it takes a lot of work to actually get it through this process. Now, after that committee action hearing, the committee action results are posted on the web, and I believe they are posted for 60 days for people to take a look at, and then there's a public comment period sought for all of those actions that are taken. After that, the public comments are posted publicly on their website so that everybody has a chance to look at it. And then after that, there is a public comments hearing. And at that meeting, essentially what happens is all of the members, the 64,000 of them, anybody who's present, can do a up or down vote, and whether that needs to be included in the code, and essentially everything that passes the majority gets included in the new edition of publication. Now, the ICC prides itself, one of its operating foundations is that they are free and open forums. They have decision transparency, representation of all interests. There is due process, there is an appeal process, and in the end, the only things that make it into code is stuff that has majority consensus of the committee and a simple majority of the members that goes into that code. Now, I'm sorry, I might be going the wrong direction. What's important here is when a new code is published, so now we know essentially the process that this company goes through to determine the code. They publish the new edition every 3 years, and it is up to each individual jurisdiction to decide on their own what codes are adopted. So in Washington State, the Washington State adopts a basic set of codes applicable for our state. And as a matter of fact, when you order your codes from ICC, they have a specific Washington State book that if you're from Washington State, you can just order that book. So instead of getting 10 books and only, small sections of each one apply, they just combine it into a single book that's been adopted by the Washington State Legislature. And then, of course, Woodland adopts that, and they can adopt the set as adopted by the state, but we can also add any additional codes that we feel protect our community in addition to the ones, the minimum bar set by the state. And so the Washington State itself has RCWs, and that's 1727070, that creates the State Building Code Council. And they are essentially an independent board of advisors that give the legislature and the governor's office advice on the building code, and they recommend the applicable codes to the state. But ultimately, that decision is made by the state itself, what it adopts. Washington State SBCC has 15 members, 5 of which are ex officio council members, and they are essentially 2 state house representatives from each party, and then a nonpartisan appointment that goes in there as well. They currently have 4 technical advisory groups that are experts in the individual codes that are shown up there: fire code, building code, then there's a plumbing, mechanical, and ventilation code, TAG, and then the energy code and commercial code technical advisory committee. So that's all in state RCW that establishes how we do that. Woodland in itself adopts our codes in section Woodland Municipal Code 1404, and it was most recently adopted in February 20th, 2024 under Ordinance 1554, and it adopts the 2021 code book that is the most recent version that has been adopted. So again, this is the code section that I was referring to as the Retooling Our Code batch. It talks about yard means an open, unoccupied space other than a court, as defined in the Uniform Building Code, unobstructed from the ground to the sky, yada, yada, yada. And what the proposed change was is eliminating the Uniform Building Code, which hasn't been in existence since 2004, and replace it with the actual term that is adopted. So for all practical purposes, our definition incorporates a definition that does not exist. So we might as well have no definition because it doesn't exist. And we're correcting this definition will not remove any local decision-making authority just because we are adopting an international building code definition. And so in summary, this, the International Code Council, which writes these codes, is an American company. It develops codes in partnership with industry and regulators. It is a transparent process. Anyone can get involved, even local citizens who are concerned about international involvement in building decisions. The majority of votes or the consensus technical review overcomes all opposition. It's by design. The majority vote by the members for applicability ensures that the majority of the members feel it's applicable once it meets the technical standards. Should it be adopted, that's a majority vote. And then Washington State establishes minimum codes, and every jurisdiction has the autonomy to adopt safer codes. Are there any questions?
My only question isn't really relevant, but who's your building official? Is that the Public Works Director? Or
So I'm
is that you?
technically the building official,
You are?
but it's delegated by our contract with Townsend and Associates, who function as our
Plan review.
technical expert and our plans reviewers and inspectors.
You're gonna knock them dead. It's gonna be great.
All right. Thank you
Riveting.
very much.
Yeah, it's going. Thanks, Travis. I appreciate you going over to put that together. All right, any more staff reports, city scuttlebutt? Anything at all? We're adjourned at 8:31 PM. Great job, everybody. Thanks so much. Thanks for coming out. Grab donuts. Thanks, staff. Great work. You count.